The morning sun filtered through the curtains of the Walker household, casting a warm glow over the kitchen. The smell of fresh coffee and buttered toast filled the air as Madeline set down 2 plates at the table. Ethan Walker, her husband, was already dressed in his police uniform, his badge glinting under the light. His salt and pepper hair was still damp from his morning shower, and as he flipped through the newspaper, he barely noticed the way Madeline's fingers drummed anxiously against the table. "You're quiet this morning," he finally said, sipping his coffee. Madeline hesitated before answering. "I saw her again." Ethan lowered the newspaper. "Who?" "The little girl." Ethan frowned. "The one you mentioned yesterday?" Madeline nodded. "She was outside, across the street, just standing there, watching." Ethan set down his coffee cup and leaned forward. "Did you talk to her?" "I tried," Madeline admitted. "But by the time I moved, she was gone, just like before." Ethan sighed. "Maddie, it's probably nothing. Could be a neighborhood kid wandering around." Madeline shook her head. "It's not just that, Ethan. There's something about her. The way she looks at me. It's like she wants to say something but can't." Ethan reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "I'll ask around today. See if any of the neighbors know her." Madeline exhaled, nodding. She knew Ethan was trying to reassure her, but deep down, she wasn't convinced. Something wasn't right. Later that day, Madeline found herself at the community center, her mind still clouded by the morning's conversation. As she stacked boxes of canned goods for the shelter, she heard the faint sound of footsteps behind her. Turning slowly, her eyes scanned the room. Empty. She shook her head, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. Maybe she was just being paranoid. But then, as she turned back to her work, she felt it again. That piercing gaze. This time, she didn't hesitate. She whirled around, and there she was, the little girl. She was peeking from behind a bookshelf, her small fingers clutching the wooden frame. Dark curls framed her face, and her wide brown eyes were filled with something Madeline couldn't quite place. Fear? Curiosity? Desperation? Madeline took a slow step forward. "Hey there," she said softly. The girl flinched. Madeline stopped. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." The child said nothing, only staring at her with an intensity that made Madeline's chest tighten. "What's your name?" She tried again. Still nothing. Then, just as suddenly as she appeared, the girl turned and darted away, disappearing into the hallway. Madeline rushed after her, her heart pounding. But when she reached the hallway, it was empty. She was gone. Again. That night, as Madeline walked home, she kept glancing over her shoulder. The sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. She was nearly home when she felt it. The prickling sensation of being watched. Her steps slowed. Her fingers clenched around the strap of her purse. She turned. The girl was there, standing at the corner of the street. Madeline swallowed hard, raising her hand in a gentle wave. The girl didn't move. Madeline took a step forward. "Are you lost?" Silence. The wind rustled the leaves, filling the empty street with an eerie hush. Then, before Madeline could say another word, the girl turned and ran. Madeline broke into a sprint. "Wait!" She chased her down the sidewalk, through a narrow alley, her breath coming fast. The girl was small but quick, slipping between parked cars and darting through the dimming light. Madeline was fast, but not fast enough. By the time she reached the other side of the alley, the girl had vanished into the night. Madeline stood there, catching her breath, her hands on her knees. She had been so close, too close. That evening, when Ethan got home, he found Madeline sitting on the porch, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "She was there again," she murmured, before he could even ask. Ethan frowned, sitting beside her. "Where?" "Outside, on our street. She ran when I tried to talk to her." Ethan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Maddie, I know this is bothering you, but you have to consider—" "This isn't normal, Ethan," Madeline interrupted, her voice firm. "She's not just wandering. She's following me." Ethan studied her face. He knew his wife. He knew when she was overthinking, but he also knew when she was right. And right now, he wasn't sure which one this was. "We'll figure it out," he said finally. "I'll start looking into it tomorrow." Madeline nodded, though she wasn't sure that would be enough. As they sat together on the porch, the streetlights flickered on, casting a soft glow over the quiet road. And somewhere, hidden in the shadows, a pair of brown eyes continued to watch. The next morning, Madeline woke up, with a heavy weight pressing on her chest. She had spent most of the night tossing and turning, the image of the little girl's wide, haunted eyes burning in her mind. Who was she? Why was she always watching? And more importantly, why did she run every time Madeline tried to get close? Downstairs, Ethan was already at the table, nursing a cup of coffee as he scrolled through his laptop. His police badge lay beside him, catching the early morning sunlight. "Morning," Madeline greeted, though she barely sounded awake. Ethan looked up. "Didn't sleep well?" Madeline shook her head, grabbing a mug and pouring herself some coffee. "I couldn't stop thinking about her." Ethan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I did some checking last night. No reports of a missing child that match her description. Not in Oak Ridge, and not in any of the surrounding counties." Madeline frowned. "That doesn't make sense. Someone must be looking for her." "Maybe," Ethan admitted. "Or maybe she's slipping through the cracks." Madeline sat down across from him. "Then we need to find out why." The day was warmer than usual, the sun casting golden light over Oak Ridge as Madeline made her way to the community center. She had barely stepped through the doors when Lisa Carter, her closest friend and a nurse at the local hospital, appeared beside her. "You look exhausted," Lisa noted, handing her a coffee. Madeline accepted it gratefully. "Long night." Lisa raised an eyebrow. "This about your mystery girl?" Madeline exhaled sharply. "She was outside my house last night." Lisa's expression turned serious. "That's unsettling." Madeline took a sip of her coffee, the warmth calming her frayed nerves. "I tried talking to her again, but she ran. She sighed. "Something's not right, Lisa." Lisa crossed her arms. "You know, I remember something. A few years ago, before you moved here, there was a woman, Lena Harrison, who went missing. She was pregnant at the time." Madeline stilled. "What happened to her?" Lisa hesitated. "She just vanished. No body, no trace. The case went cold. But if she had the baby before she disappeared?" Madeline's mind raced. Could this be connected? Was the little girl? Could she be Lena Harrison's daughter? That afternoon, Madeline found herself walking through the park, scanning every corner, every playground, every bench. And then she saw her. The little girl stood by the edge of the swings, watching a group of children playing. Her hands were balled into fists, her posture tense, as if she wanted to join but couldn't. Madeline took a slow, measured step forward. "Hey," she called gently. The girl flinched, her small body going rigid. Madeline raised both hands in a peaceful gesture. "It's okay. I just want to talk." The girl hesitated. Madeline took another step. "My name's Madeline. What's yours?" For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, barely above a whisper, the girl spoke. "Lena." Madeline's breath caught. It wasn't much, But it was a start. That night, Madeline sat in the living room with Ethan, relaying everything that had happened. She said her name is Lena, Madeline murmured. Ethan, who had been reviewing case files, looked up sharply. Are you sure? Madeline nodded. Ethan closed his laptop and leaned forward. Maddie, if this girl really is Lena Harrison's daughter, then we need to find out what happened to her mother. Madeline's fingers tightened around her coffee mug. And if she's in danger? Ethan's jaw tensed. Then we protect her. Outside, in the quiet night, a small figure lingered just beyond the glow of the streetlights, watching, waiting, for someone to finally listen. The next morning, Ethan left early, heading straight to the Oak Ridge Police Department. The information Madeline had given him about the little girl weighed heavily on his mind. If her name really was Lena, and if she was connected to the missing person case from years ago, then there was more to this than just a lost child. Ethan sat down at his desk and logged into the department's database. He typed Lena Harrison into the system. A few moments later, the file appeared on his screen. Date of disappearance, 7 years ago. Status, case closed, insufficient evidence. Last seen, Oak Ridge at her apartment complex. Significant details, reported missing by her employer when she failed to show up for work. Apartment was found abandoned, door locked. No signs of forced entry. Neighbors recalled hearing an argument the night before. Ethan scrolled down. His eyes locked onto the name listed under primary suspect, Brandon Cross. He frowned. The name felt familiar. Clicking on it, he pulled up Cross's record. Charges: domestic abuse, aggravated assault, relation to victim, former boyfriend, last known address, Oak Ridge, but moved out of state. Shortly after Lena's disappearance, Ethan leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping against the desk. Cross had a history of violence, and Lena had been pregnant when she vanished. If she had given birth before she disappeared, then the child, this little girl, was hers. And if that was true, where had she been all these years? And where was Lena now? Later that afternoon, Madeline sat at her desk at the community center, staring at the notepad in front of her. The name Lena was scribbled over and over, as if writing it down would somehow make the mystery clearer. A soft knock on her office door broke her concentration. Lisa peered inside. You got a minute? Madeline nodded, setting down her pen. What's up? Lisa stepped inside and shut the door behind her. I was thinking about what you told me yesterday, about the little girl, about Lena Harrison, and I remembered something else. Madeline leaned forward. Go on. Lisa hesitated. There was an old woman, Martha Jenkins, who lived in the same apartment complex as Lena. I used to check on her at the hospital. She told me once that she heard screaming the night Lena disappeared, but she never reported it. Madeline's stomach twisted. Why not? Lisa sighed. She was scared. She said she didn't want to get involved. But maybe if you talk to her now. Madeline grabbed her coat. Let's go. Martha Jenkins lived in a small, weathered house on the outskirts of town. The old woman opened the door with a suspicious glance before recognition softened her face. Oh, Lisa, it's you. Lisa smiled warmly. Hi, Martha. I brought a friend. This is Madeline Walker. She runs the community center. Martha's gaze flickered between them before she stepped aside. Come in. Inside, the house was filled with the scent of herbal tea. Books lined the walls, and a small radio played soft jazz. Madeline wasted no time. Martha, we're looking into a little girl who might be connected to someone who went missing years ago, Lena Harrison. You told Lisa once that you heard something the night she disappeared. Could you tell us what you remember? Martha's expression darkened. She set down her teacup, her hands trembling slightly. I shouldn't be talking about this, she murmured. Madeline's voice softened. Martha, if there's something you know, it might help us protect this child. Martha closed her eyes for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was low. It was late that night, maybe around midnight. I was getting ready for bed when I heard shouting from Lena's apartment, a man's voice, angry. Then there was a crash, a scream, and then silence. Madeline's pulse quickened. Did you see anything? Martha shook her head. Number, but I heard footsteps, heavy ones, going down the stairs. When I looked out my window, I saw a car speeding off. Lisa asked gently, Did you recognize the voice? Martha hesitated. Then she nodded. It was her boyfriend, Brandon Cross. A chill ran through Madeline. Martha's voice dropped to a whisper. That girl you're asking about? If she's really Lena's daughter, I'd be careful. If Cross is back in town, he won't let her go so easily. That night, Madeline sat in her car, outside the community center, waiting. She had a feeling the little girl would come, and she was right. The small figure emerged from the shadows, hesitantly stepping forward. Madeline rolled down her window. Hey, sweetheart. The girl didn't run this time. Madeline got out of the car and crouched down to her level. Are you hungry? A nod. Madeline smiled gently. Come inside. I have some sandwiches. Inside the community center, Madeline handed the girl a sandwich and a juice box. The child took small, careful bites. Can I ask you something? Madeline said softly. The girl looked up, her big brown eyes wary but curious. You told me your name is Lena. Is that your first name, Sauce, or your last name? The child hesitated. Then, for the first time, she whispered, Amara. Madeline's breath caught. Amara. It was a beautiful name, a name that carried meaning. Madeline smiled. That's a lovely name, sweetheart. Can you tell me your last name? Amara shook her head. Madeline swallowed her disappointment. Okay, that's okay. Then, in a voice barely louder than a breath, Amara said something else. My mommy is missing. Madeline felt her heart break. I know, sweetie. I know. Amara's tiny fingers clenched around the fabric of her oversized sweater. He took her away. Madeline's blood ran cold. Who did? Amara's lower lip trembled. The bad man? Madeline's hands shook. She forced herself to stay calm. Do you remember his name? Amara nodded, and then she whispered it. Brandon. Madeline's heart pounded in her chest. She reached for her phone and dialed Ethan's number. We have a problem, she whispered. A big one. Ethan gripped the steering wheel tightly as he sped towards the community center. Madeline's voice had been steady over the phone, but he knew her well enough to recognize the underlying tension. That name alone sent alarms ringing in his mind. He had spent the past few hours combing through old police reports on Brandon Cross. The man had a violent past, a history of controlling behavior, and a chilling pattern of women in his life disappearing or filing restraining orders. Now, Ethan had confirmation that Amara, the little girl who had been following Madeline, was his child. And if she had run away from him, there was no telling what she had seen or endured. As soon as he pulled into the parking lot, he spotted Madeline standing just outside the entrance, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The dim glow of the streetlights cast a worried shadow over her face. Ethan stepped out of the car. Where is she? Inside, Madeline said, her voice hushed. She's shaken up, but she's talking more now. Did she say where Cross is? Madeline shook her head. Not yet. She's too scared. Ethan exhaled sharply. All right, let me talk to her. Inside the community center, Amara sat curled up on the couch, a blanket wrapped around her small frame. She clutched a juice box in one hand, sipping it in slow, thoughtful pulls. Her wide brown eyes flicked toward Ethan as he entered, immediately filled with wary hesitation. Ethan knelt in front of her, keeping his voice soft. "Hey, Amara. I'm Ethan. I'm Madeline's husband." The little girl didn't respond, but she didn't look away either. That was a good sign. "I know you've been really brave, and I want to help you," he continued. "But to do that, I need to understand what's going on. Can you tell me about Brandon?" Amara's grip tightened on the blanket. Her lower lip trembled. For a moment, Ethan thought she might retreat back into silence. But then, in a voice so soft he almost didn't hear, she whispered, "He's coming." The words sent a chill down Ethan's spine. Madeline sucked in a breath. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Amara's gaze darted between them. "I saw him. Yesterday. He was watching." Ethan's pulse pounded. "Watching where?" "At the park." Amara's fingers curled around the blanket, her knuckles turning white. "I was hiding. But he was there. Looking for me." Ethan exchanged a quick glance with Madeline. This changed everything. If Brandon was in town, it meant he knew Amara was here. And if he was looking for her, it was only a matter of time before he tried to take her back. Madeline placed a reassuring hand on Amara's back. "You're safe here, sweetheart. We won't let him take you." But Amara's eyes remained wide with fear. Ethan stood abruptly. "We need to move her. Now." Ethan and Madeline drove Amara to their house, keeping a close watch for any signs of a tail. Once they arrived, Ethan locked the doors and pulled the curtains shut. Then he called the station. "Captain, I need surveillance on my house immediately," he said. "And I want eyes on Brandon Cross. If he's in town, I want to know his every move." His captain hesitated. "Ethan, you're talking about an old case. Cross was never convicted. We don't have probable cause to go after him now." Ethan clenched his jaw. "Then find a reason. He's been watching Amara. That's enough for me." "Keep an eye on the girl," the captain relented. "But don't push too hard. We don't want to stir up trouble if we don't have concrete evidence." Ethan hung up and turned to Madeline. "We're on our own for now." She crossed her arms. "Then we do this ourselves." Ethan nodded grimly. "We protect Amara, and we find out what happened to her mother." The next morning, Ethan stepped outside to grab the morning paper. As he bent down to pick it up, he noticed something tucked beneath it, a folded piece of paper. He opened it, his stomach twisting as he read the message scrawled in red ink. "Stay out of it." Ethan's blood boiled. He scanned the street, but no one was in sight. Someone had been here, watching. Brandon. He stormed inside, slamming the door shut. Madeline looked up, startled. "What's wrong?" He handed her the note. "He's warning us off." Her face paled. Ethan clenched his fists. "That bastard just made a mistake. He thinks I scare easily." Madeline met his gaze. "What do?" "We fight back." Ethan spent the next few hours digging deeper into Cross's whereabouts. A contact at a neighboring precinct confirmed that Brandon had returned to Oak Ridge a week ago. No permanent address, no listed employment, just a man moving in the shadows. Ethan took a breath and called a familiar number. A voice answered on the second ring. "Walker. Been a while." "Michael, I need a favor." Michael Hayes was an old friend from Ethan's academy days. He had left the force years ago to work in private security, which meant he had access to information that the department didn't always get legally. "You still tracking off-the-grid individuals?" Ethan asked. Michael chuckled. "You need me to find someone, don't you?" Ethan cut to the chase. Brandon Cross. He's back in town. I need to know where he's staying, who he's talking to, and what the hell he's up to." There was a pause. Then Michael said, "Give me a few hours." Ethan hung up, his pulse steady but alert. Brandon had made a mistake by warning them. Now, Ethan was going to find him. And this time, he wasn't going to let the bastard walk away. That evening, as Madeline tucked Amara into bed, the little girl hesitated. "Madeline," she whispered. Madeline sat beside her. "Yes, sweetheart." Amara hesitated, then clutched Madeline's hand tightly. "If I tell you something, can you keep me safe?" Madeline's heart clenched. "Always?" Amara took a shaky breath. "I remember something. Something about the night my mommy disappeared." Madeline stayed still, letting Amara take her time. The little girl's voice was barely a whisper. "There was a fight. Mommy was crying. He was yelling." Madeline's stomach twisted. "Brandon?" Amara nodded. "And then there was a loud sound, like something breaking." Tears welled in Amara's eyes. And then she was gone. Madeline wrapped her arms around the little girl, her heart breaking. Ethan entered the room, just in time to see the fear in Amara's eyes. He met Madeline's gaze and knew they had just found their missing link. Amara hadn't just run away from Cross. She had witnessed something terrible. And if Brandon knew she remembered, he would come for her. The house was silent, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He lay in bed next to Madeline, his mind racing. Amara's whispered words from earlier in the evening echoed in his ears. There was a fight. Mommy was crying. He was yelling. And then she was gone. Brandon had taken Lena. Ethan was sure of it. But how? And why hadn't Lena's body ever been found? He turned to look at Madeline, who was lying awake, staring at the ceiling. "You're thinking the same thing I am, aren't you?" he asked softly. Madeline nodded, gripping the blanket tightly. If she saw something that night, Brandon will do anything to make sure she never talks. Ethan exhaled sharply, rubbing his face. "Then we can't wait for him to come to us. We have to move first." The next morning, Ethan checked the security cameras he had installed around the house overnight. He didn't expect to see anything unusual, but as the footage played, his blood ran cold. At 3:17 a.m., a shadowy figure appeared at the edge of their property. The person never got close enough for the cameras to capture their face, but they lingered for over 20 minutes before disappearing back into the darkness. Ethan's jaw clenched. He didn't need to see the face to know who it was. Brandon was watching them. He turned to Madeline, who had just entered the room, still in her robe. "We need to get Amara out of here." Madeline's face paled. "How soon?" Ethan shut his laptop with a sharp snap. "Now." Ethan and Madeline packed a small bag for Amara, keeping their movements discreet. They planned to take her somewhere safe until they could figure out their next move. But Brandon was one step ahead of them. As they stepped outside to the car, Ethan noticed a black SUV parked down the street. His stomach dropped. Then, the SUV roared to life. "Inside the house, now," Ethan shouted, shoving Madeline and Amara back through the front door. The SUV accelerated toward them. Ethan barely managed to slam the door shut before the sound of screeching tires filled the air. A loud thud followed as the vehicle rammed into their porch steps. Madeline screamed. Amara clung to her, sobbing. Ethan grabbed his gun and rushed to the window. The SUV's doors flew open, and two masked men jumped out. They were coming for Amara. Ethan didn't hesitate. He fired 2 warning shots into the air. The men froze. "Next shot won't be a warning," Ethan barked. For a split second, hesitation flickered in the men's stance. Then, They bolted back into the SUV. The tires screeched as the vehicle sped away. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. Madeline was still holding Amara, her body shaking. Ethan, they were going to take her. I know, Ethan said grimly. He pulled out his phone and dialed. Captain, he said the moment the line connected. We have a serious problem. They just tried to kidnap Amara. With the police now actively searching for Brandon and his men, Ethan knew they couldn't stay home. By nightfall, he had moved Madeline and Amara to a safe house, a small secured cabin on the outskirts of town. Ethan knelt in front of Amara. I know you're scarred, sweetheart, but I promise, we're going to keep you safe. The little girl clung to him. I don't want him to find me. Madeline smoothed Amara's hair, her eyes full of unspoken worry. He won't, she whispered. Ethan won't let him. Ethan kissed the top of Madeline's head and stood. I need to go back into town, see what I can dig up. Madeline's grip on his arm tightened. Be careful. I will, Ethan promised. But in his gut, he knew this wasn't over. It was just beginning. Ethan spent the next 2 days combing through old police records, witness statements, and phone records related to Lena's disappearance. And then he found it. A bank transaction from 7 years ago. The night Lena vanished, someone had wired $25,000 into Brandon's account. The sender, a shell company linked to a known criminal enterprise. Ethan's heart pounded. This wasn't just domestic violence. This was organized crime. And Brandon hadn't just taken Lena. He had been paid to make her disappear. Ethan returned to the safe house late that night, his mind racing with this new revelation. Madeline met him at the door. Did you find something? Ethan hesitated before nodding. Madeline. I think Lena was silenced. Madeline's eyes widened. You think she's... I don't know, Ethan admitted. But I do know this. Brandon was paid to get rid of her. And if he knows we're close to uncovering the truth... He glanced toward Amara, who was fast asleep on the couch. He won't stop until she's gone too. Madeline swallowed hard. So, what do we do? Ethan clenched his jaw. We set a trap. Ethan arranged for false information to be leaked. Info suggesting that Amara had been moved to another location. Then, he and his team set up surveillance around Oak Ridge, waiting for Brandon to take the bait. It didn't take long. 2 nights later, a black SUV rolled into town. Brandon was back, and this time, Ethan was ready. Ethan and his team tailed the SUV to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. Weapons drawn, they moved in. Inside, they found Brandon alone, sitting on a crate, as if expecting them. Ethan stepped forward. It's over, Cross. Brandon smirked. You think so? Then, the lights went out. Gunfire erupted. The warehouse exploded into chaos. Bullets whizzed past, as Ethan took cover behind a stack of wooden pallets. Brandon had men waiting. This wasn't just an arrest. It was an ambush. Madeline's voice rang through his earpiece. Ethan, get out of there. But Ethan wasn't leaving without answers. He moved through the shadows, taking out Brandon's men one by one. Finally, he reached Brandon. They fought hand to hand, exchanging brutal blows. But Ethan had something Brandon didn't. Rage. For Amara. For Lena. For Madeline. With one final punch, Ethan knocked Brandon to the ground. The police stormed in seconds later, securing the area. Brandon looked up at Ethan, bloody and beaten, and laughed. You think this ends with me, he sneered. You have no idea who you're messing with. Ethan's jaw tightened. Maybe not. But I do know one thing. He leaned in. You're never touching that little girl again. The night air was thick with tension. A single street lamp flickered at the edge of the alleyway, casting long shadows that danced against the cracked brick walls. Ethan Walker stood in the darkness, his breath slow and measured. His fingers gripped the cold steel of his firearm, every muscle in his body coiled and ready. Tonight was the night. They had Brandon Cross, exactly where they wanted him. After days of relentless investigation, Ethan had finally found the missing piece of the puzzle, proof that Cross had been working with an underground crime syndicate, trafficking women and children across state lines. And more importantly, proof that Lena Harrison was still alive. Madeline sat on the worn-out couch of the safe house, her arms wrapped protectively around Amara. The little girl had fallen asleep in her lap, her tiny hands curled into fists against Madeline's sweater. Ethan kneeled beside them. "I need you both to stay here," he said gently. Madeline looked up at him, her green eyes filled with worry. "Ethan, are you sure about this?" Ethan exhaled slowly, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. "It's the only way. We leaked false intel that Amara was being transferred out of town tonight. If Cross takes the bait, we'll have him. For good." Madeline's fingers tightened around Amara's small frame. "And if something goes wrong?" Ethan reached for her hand, squeezing it. "Nothing's going to happen to us, I promise." But even as the words left his mouth, he wasn't sure he believed them. At exactly 11:37 p.m., Ethan's radio crackled to life. "He's moving." The black SUV they had been tracking all week sped through the empty streets of Oak Ridge, its headlights bouncing off the rain-slick pavement. Ethan's grip on the steering wheel tightened as he floored the gas, his own unmarked car tailing the vehicle at a distance. "He's heading toward the old steel factory." A voice came through his earpiece. "Looks like he took the bait." Ethan's heart pounded. This was it. He turned sharply, following the SUV onto an abandoned road that led into the industrial district. Up ahead, the steel factory loomed, a massive rusted skeleton of a building, its windows shattered and its walls covered in graffiti. The SUV skidded to a halt near one of the entrances. Ethan killed his headlights and rolled to a stop behind a stack of shipping containers. Silence. Then, a door slammed. A figure emerged from the SUV. Brandon Cross. And he wasn't alone. Through the scope of his rifle, Ethan counted 4 men with Cross, all heavily armed. His gut clenched. This wasn't just a handoff. This was an execution. Ethan tapped his radio. Eyes on Cross. "He's got backup." A voice answered immediately. "Hold position. SWAT is en route." Ethan's jaw tightened. "We don't have time." Through the binoculars, he saw Cross pull out his phone, his face illuminated by the screen. He was making a call. A cold chill crept up Ethan's spine. If Cross was contacting who Ethan thought he was, they were all in serious trouble. He made a decision. No more waiting. Ethan moved. With silent precision, he crept along the side of the containers, keeping low. Cross was barking orders, waving a hand toward the factory doors. The men fanned out, their weapons drawn. Then, Ethan saw her. A woman, bound and gagged. Her face battered, her clothes torn. Lena Harrison. Rage ignited inside Ethan. He raised his weapon. Crack! The first shot rang out, striking one of Cross's men in the shoulder. Chaos erupted. Gunfire exploded in the night air as the men dove for cover. Ethan ducked behind a rusted-out truck, his pulse hammering. He fired again. Another hit. But Cross was already dragging Lena toward the SUV. He was getting away. Back at the safe house, Madeline jolted awake. Something wasn't right. She glanced at the clock. 12:12 a.m. The house was silent. Too silent. She gently moved Amara off her lap and rose to her feet. Then she heard it. A floorboard creaked. Her stomach dropped. Someone was in the house. Madeline's heart pounded as she reached for the closest weapon, a kitchen knife. She moved toward the hallway, her bare feet silent against the wooden floor. Another sound. A shadow shifted in the dim light. Then, a hand clamped over her mouth. She thrashed, kicking wildly. The knife slipped from her fingers as a masked man dragged her backward. "Make a sound and I kill you," the man growled. Madeline's blood ran cold. Through the doorway she could see Amara, still sleeping, completely unaware. Madeline's heart screamed, but she forced herself to stay calm. Then, a crash. The window shattered. The man staggered back, cursing. A gunshot echoed through the room, and standing in the doorway, Ethan. The kidnapper tried to run. He never made it past the porch. Ethan tackled him to the ground, twisting the man's arm behind his back until he heard the sickening pop of bone dislocating. The man screamed. Madeline grabbed Amara, who had woken up and was now crying into her chest. Ethan pinned the man down. "Who sent you?" The man gritted his teeth. "You're too late. They already have her." Ethan's heart stopped. "What do you mean?" The man grinned. "Lena, you saved the wrong woman." Ethan's breath caught. Lena was still missing, and someone worse than Brandon Cross, had her. SWAT arrived minutes later, securing the scene. The kidnapper was dragged away, but he never said another word. Ethan stood in the doorway, his fists clenched. Madeline touched his arm. "Ethan, what did he mean?" Ethan turned to her, his jaw tight. "He meant that whoever was behind this isn't done yet." Madeline's breath hitched. "Then what do we do?" Ethan exhaled, his muscles coiled with tension. "We go after them." Because now, it wasn't just about justice. It was about finishing what they started. And Ethan Walker never left things unfinished. The night was thick with uncertainty. A cold wind howled through the quiet streets of Oak Ridge, rattling the old street lamps as Ethan Walker stood outside his precinct, his mind racing. The weight of the last 24 hours clung to him like a suffocating fog. Brandon Cross was in custody, but the real threat had just begun. Somewhere out there, Lena Harrison was still a prisoner. And if what the kidnapper had said was true, Cross had never been the one pulling the strings. Someone bigger was behind this, and Ethan was going to find out who. Inside the dimly lit precinct, Ethan's team gathered around a cluttered table, scanning maps, documents, and crime scene photos. The atmosphere was tense, charged with an energy that hovered between determination and exhaustion. Detective Marcus Reed, Ethan's longtime partner, ran a hand over his shaved head. "Cross isn't talking," he muttered, shaking his head. "Says he doesn't know where Lena is." Ethan clenched his jaw. "He's lying." Marcus exhaled sharply. "Maybe. But what if he's not?" Ethan turned toward the whiteboard, where they had mapped out everything they knew about the case. Cross was working for someone powerful enough to cover Lena's tracks for 7 years, someone dangerous enough to come after my wife and Amara. The mention of Madeline and Amara sent a fresh wave of anger through him. Marcus leaned forward, his voice lower. "If Lena's still alive, she's not just a witness anymore, Ethan. She's a liability to whoever's running this operation." Ethan's grip tightened around the edge of the table. "Then we need to find her before they silence her for good." Back at the safe house, Madeline Walker sat on the couch, her fingers laced tightly around a steaming cup of coffee. Across the room, Amara sat curled up in a blanket, her big brown eyes fixed on the flickering television screen, though it was clear her mind was elsewhere. Madeline's stomach twisted. Amara had barely spoken since last night, since the break-in, since the terrifying realization that their enemies knew exactly where to find them. Madeline set her cup down and moved closer, sitting beside Amara. "Sweetheart," she said gently, brushing a strand of hair from the girl's face. "Are you okay?" Amara hesitated. Then her small voice cut through the silence. "You're going to leave me, aren't you?" Madeline's heart shattered. "What? No, honey. Why would you think that?" Amara looked down at her hands, her fingers twisting the blanket. "Because that's what grown-ups do. They always leave." Madeline swallowed hard, her throat tight. "Not this time. Not ever." Amara's lip trembled. "But the bad people are looking for me. You and Ethan, you'll be safer without me." Madeline's heart clenched. This child, this innocent little girl, had lived her entire life expecting abandonment, expecting the people who cared for her to disappear. Madeline reached for Amara's hands and held them tightly. "You listen to me, okay? Ethan and I would never, ever leave you, no matter what." A single tear slipped down Amara's cheek. "Even if they come back?" Madeline nodded firmly. "Even then." For the first time in hours, Amara leaned into Madeline, letting herself be held. Madeline closed her eyes, silently vowing no one would ever take this child from her. The precinct was eerily quiet when Ethan's phone buzzed. A text. Unknown number. "You're looking in the wrong place. Cross was just a pawn. If you want answers, come alone. 10 p.m. 405 Winston Street. No cops." Ethan stared at the screen, his pulse quickening. Marcus, who had been flipping through case files, noticed Ethan's expression. "What is it?" Ethan debated for a second before handing over the phone. Marcus read the message, then swore under his breath. "This is a trap." Ethan exhaled. "I know." Marcus threw the phone onto the table. "So, tell me you're not actually considering going." Ethan didn't answer. Marcus narrowed his eyes. "Damn it, Ethan." Ethan grabbed his jacket. "We don't have another lead. If this is our only shot at finding Lena, I'm taking it." Marcus stood, blocking his path. "No backup? No wire? That's suicide." Ethan smirked. "Then it's a good thing I'm not planning on dying tonight." Marcus swore again. "You're an idiot." Ethan clapped a hand on his partner's shoulder. "I'll text you when I get there. If I'm not out in 20 minutes, I come in guns blazing." Ethan grinned. "Exactly." At 10 p.m. sharp, Ethan pulled up to 405 Winston Street, an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. The air smelled of rust and rain. The distant hum of traffic, the only sound in the otherwise lifeless district. He stepped out of his car, hand resting on the holster at his hip. The warehouse door creaked as he pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and oil. Shadows stretched across the concrete floor, broken only by the dim glow of a single hanging light. And beneath that light, a man, late 50s, graying hair, sharp eyes that had seen too much. He was waiting. Ethan took a step forward. "You the one who sent the text?" The man exhaled, reaching for something inside his coat. Ethan tensed until he saw what it was. A photo. He tossed it onto the ground between them. Ethan bent down, picking it up. His stomach dropped. It was Lena, and she was alive. Barely. Bruised, bloodied, eyes swollen shut. A timestamp at the bottom read, "He taken 2 days ago." Ethan's blood ran cold. The man watched him carefully. "You're out of your league, detective." Ethan looked up, rage simmering beneath his calm facade. "Where is she?" The man tilted his head. "What are you willing to do to find out?" Ethan clenched his jaw. "Whatever it takes." The man smirked. "Good. Because you just stepped into something a lot bigger than you realize." He reached into his pocket again, this time pulling out a key. He tossed it to Ethan. "It's not Lena you should be worried about." Ethan caught the key. confusion flickering across his face. What the hell does that mean? The man took a step back into the shadows. It means you're asking the wrong questions. And before Ethan could react, the warehouse exploded. The blast tore through the warehouse, sending flames and debris flying in all directions. The force of the explosion threw Ethan backward, his body slamming hard against the pavement outside. The deafening roar faded into a dull ringing in his ears, his vision blurring as he fought to stay conscious. For a moment, everything was chaos. Flames licked at the sky, smoke billowing into the cold night air. Sparks crackled as pieces of the crumbling building rained down around him. Ethan coughed, forcing himself up onto his elbows, his mind spinning. The man, the informant, was gone. Either he'd planned his escape, or he'd been swallowed by the inferno. But the photo of Lena, now singed around the edges, was still clutched in Ethan's shaking hand. He had less than 2 days to find her. Back at the safe house, Madeline paced the small living room, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Something was wrong. She had called Ethan 3 times. No answer. Her gut churned with unease. She had a terrible feeling that something had happened. Something bad. The front door creaked open, and Marcus stepped inside. His expression was grim, his shirt streaked with soot. Madeline froze. "Where's Ethan?" Marcus exhaled sharply. "He's alive." Relief flooded her, until she saw the look in Marcus's eyes. "But," she pressed. Marcus sighed. "There was an explosion. Someone set him up." Madeline's breath caught. "Is he hurt?" "He's banged up, but he's breathing. That's the good news." She clenched her fists. "And the bad news?" Marcus hesitated. "Whoever we're dealing with, they're not just a bunch of criminals. They have resources. They knew Ethan was coming." Madeline swallowed hard. "Which means they know we're involved." A chilling realization settled between them. They weren't just chasing a missing person anymore. They were in a war. Despite Marcus's protests, Ethan refused to be taken to a hospital. He sat on the edge of the precinct locker room bench, pressing a bag of ice against the side of his face, where a piece of debris had cut him. His thoughts were racing. The photo, the key, and the last thing the man had said. "It's not Lena you should be worried about." Who else was involved? His phone buzzed in his pocket. This time he answered. "Ethan?" Madeline's voice came through, urgent. "Where the hell are you?" Marcus said, "I'm fine," he cut in. "But we've got a problem." Silence. Then, "How bad?" Ethan gritted his teeth. "The kind of bad where we either find Lena in the next 48 hours, or we start preparing for a funeral." The key Ethan had been given before the explosion was old, rusted, and labeled with the number 217. Marcus ran it through the system, cross-referencing it with local storage units, old apartment buildings, and even evidence lockers from cold cases. Bingo! Unit 217 was registered to a private storage facility on the outskirts of Oak Ridge. If there were answers, they were there. Ethan and Marcus drove in silence, tension thick in the car. As they pulled up to the facility, Ethan took a deep breath. "If things go sideways," Marcus cut him off. "I already told you, you're not doing this alone." Ethan smirked, just making sure. With weapons drawn, they moved toward the rusted door marked 217. Ethan slid the key into the lock. It clicked open, and inside was a room full of secrets. The storage unit was filled with boxes, files, and photographs, newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, documents dating back almost a decade. And in the center of it all, a crib. Ethan's blood ran cold. He picked up one of the newspapers. The headline read, "Local woman vanishes after exposing illegal adoption ring." A photo of Lena Harrison was printed beneath it. Marcus swore under his breath. Ethan, this isn't just about Cross. This is bigger. Ethan's hands tightened around the newspaper. This wasn't just a case anymore. It was a cover-up. While Ethan and Marcus were discovering the truth, Madeline and Amara were in danger. A black SUV had been parked outside the safe house for nearly an hour, engine idling. Madeline kept her movements calm, but inside, she was terrified. They'd found them. She grabbed her phone and called Ethan. It went straight to voicemail. Her stomach dropped. She turned to Amara, kneeling in front of her. Sweetheart, listen to me very carefully. If I tell you to run, you run. No questions. Understand? Amara's eyes widened, but she nodded. Madeline locked all the doors. Then she waited. Ethan's phone vibrated, and when he saw Madeline's missed call, something in his chest tightened. He dialed back. No answer. His pulse spiked. Something was wrong. Without a second thought, he and Marcus raced back to the safe house. As soon as they turned onto the street, gunfire erupted. Madeline yanked Amara behind the kitchen counter as bullets shattered the windows. The front door burst open. Masked men flooded inside. One grabbed Madeline's wrist. She fought like hell, kicked, scratched, clawed. But there were too many. Amara screamed, and then the sound of sirens. Ethan and Marcus skidded to a stop, jumping out with their guns drawn. Shots fired, screams, a blur of violence and adrenaline. Then, silence. One by one, the masked men went down. Ethan rushed inside and found Madeline clutching Amara, both of them shaking. Ethan knelt beside them, his hands shaking too. It's over, he whispered. But Madeline, she was staring at one of the unconscious attackers, her face pale. Ethan followed her gaze and felt the ground drop out from beneath him because he recognized the man. And that meant this wasn't over. Not even close. The silence after the firefight was deafening. The broken glass on the floor glistened in the dim light, reflecting the chaos that had just unfolded inside the safe house. Ethan's breathing was ragged as he surveyed the scene. Bodies sprawled across the floor, weapons kicked aside, and the acrid scent of gunpowder still hanging in the air. But all of it faded into the background when he saw Madeline's face. She wasn't looking at him. She wasn't looking at the destruction. She was staring at one of the unconscious attackers, and the look in her eyes sent a cold chill down Ethan's spine. Ethan followed her gaze and immediately understood why. Because lying there, blood trickling from a wound on his forehead, was someone they knew. Someone who shouldn't have been there. Someone who had been helping them. Marcus cursed under his breath as recognition dawned. The man on the floor wasn't just a hired thug. He was Detective Brian Carter. Ethan dropped to one knee, pressing 2 fingers to Carter's neck. His pulse was weak but steady. He was still alive, for now. Madeline's voice was hoarse. Brian Carter. Ethan, what the hell is he doing here? Ethan's jaw clenched as he stood. That's what we're about to find out. 2 uniformed officers entered the room, having responded to the emergency call. Ethan waved them over. Get an ambulance for him. He's a cop. The officers exchanged glances, but nodded, hauling Carter onto a stretcher. Madeline's hands were shaking. Ethan, if he was working for them, that means everything we've told him about Amara, about Lena. He's been feeding it right back to them. Ethan's stomach twisted. She was right. Carter had been a part of their inner circle. He'd been there from the beginning. And now, they knew they had a traitor inside the department. Marcus ran a hand down his face. If Carter was feeding Cross information, that means we have no idea how deep this thing goes. Ethan's grip on his gun tightened. Then, It's time we find out. Later that night, as Ethan and Marcus drove to the precinct to interrogate Carter, Madeline stayed behind at the safe house with Amara. But she wasn't resting. She couldn't. The weight of everything, the deception, the danger, the fact that their own allies had been compromised, was too much. And then there was Amara. The little girl was curled up on the couch, her small body wrapped in a blanket. But she wasn't sleeping. She was watching Madeline, her brown eyes filled with questions she wasn't ready to ask. Madeline sat down beside her. "You okay, sweetheart?" Amara hesitated, then nodded. "Are we still in danger?" Madeline exhaled slowly. "No, baby. Ethan and Marcus took care of it. You're safe now." Amara bit her lip, then whispered, "I don't think it's over." Madeline's heart squeezed. Neither did she. At the hospital, Carter groaned as he slowly regained consciousness. His head was bandaged, and his left arm was restrained in a sling. Ethan leaned over him, his voice dangerously low. "Start talking." Carter's eyes fluttered open, but when he saw Ethan, his expression didn't change. No guilt, no regret, no, only resignation. "I had no choice," he rasped. Ethan's fists clenched. "That's bullshit. You sold us out." Carter sighed. "You don't understand. You think this is just about Cross? It's not. Cross is small time compared to who's really pulling the strings." Ethan's eyes darkened. "Then tell me. Who?" Carter hesitated, then exhaled sharply. "Ever heard the name William Mercer?" Marcus stiffened. "Mercer? The billionaire?" Carter nodded weakly. "He's not just a billionaire. He's the billionaire. He funds everything. Politicians, law enforcement, even the goddamn courts. You think Cross was acting alone? You think Lena just vanished because she was afraid of her boyfriend?" Carter coughed, wincing. She wasn't running from Cross. She was running from Mercer. The name William Mercer hit Ethan like a freight train. Mercer was untouchable. A man so powerful that even the governor took his calls. A man with connections in every major city. A man who could make people disappear, just like he'd done with Lena. Madeline's earlier words echoed in Ethan's head. If he was feeding them information, they already know everything. His blood ran cold. If Mercer was involved, Lena wasn't just missing. She was hunted. Back at the safe house, Madeline's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, unknown number. Her stomach flipped. She hesitated, then answered. "Hello?" A distorted voice came through. "Stop looking for Lena." Madeline's breath caught. The voice continued. "This isn't your fight. Walk away and you won't get hurt." Madeline's grip tightened. "Who is this?" A low chuckle. "It doesn't matter who I am. What matters is that you listen. Because if you don't—" A pause. Then, in a tone so cold, it sent shivers down her spine. "You won't have a husband to go home to." The line went dead. Madeline's knees buckled. She barely registered Amara's voice calling her name. All she knew was one thing. This wasn't just about Lena anymore. It was war. The air in Oak Ridge was thick with tension. Ethan gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The weight of William Mercer's name still pressed heavily on his mind. A billionaire, a kingmaker, a man who could erase people from existence with just a phone call. And now, that man knew they were looking for Lena. Beside him, Marcus was silent, his fingers tapping restlessly against his knee. They both knew the truth. They weren't chasing just Cross anymore. They were going after the man who owned this entire city. And the question loomed over them like a dark cloud. Could they even win? Back at the safe house, Madeline sat motionless, still holding the phone in her trembling hand. The threat echoed in her mind. "You won't have a husband to go home to." She felt a sharp sting in her chest, but when she looked up, Amara was watching her. The little girl's big brown eyes were filled with worry. Madeline forced herself to breathe, to calm the storm raging inside her. She wouldn't let Amara see her break. She wouldn't let them win. With deliberate movements, she grabbed her laptop and started digging. If William Mercer thought he could scare her into backing down, he had severely underestimated her. Because Madeline Walker was done being afraid. Ethan pulled into a dark alley behind the police station, where Captain Howard was waiting for them. Howard's face was lined with exhaustion. "You two better have a damn good reason for calling me at this hour," he muttered. Ethan got straight to the point. "William Mercer." Howard's face went pale. He looked around the alley, as if expecting someone to be listening. "You have no idea what you're doing," he said in a hushed tone. Marcus crossed his arms. "Then, enlighten us." Howard exhaled sharply. "Mercer isn't just another corrupt businessman. He's protected. Politicians, judges, cops. You think you can take him down? You'll be dead before you get close." Ethan's voice was firm. "We don't have a choice. Lena ran because of him. And if we stop now, she's as good as dead." Howard's jaw tightened. Then, after a long pause, he said 6 words that sent a chill down Ethan's spine. "You're already on his radar, Walker." Back at the safe house, Madeline's fingers flew across the keyboard. She bypassed layers of encrypted files, searching for anything that connected Mercer to Lena's disappearance. Then, she found it. A transaction log, large sums of money being funneled into an offshore account. And attached to those payments, Lena's name. Madeline's stomach twisted. Before she could process it, her phone buzzed. It was Lisa. "You need to come to the hospital," Lisa said, her voice urgent. "Right now." Madeline grabbed her coat. She didn't hesitate. When Madeline arrived, Lisa pulled her into an empty hospital room. And what she showed her made her blood run cold. Brian Carter was dead. Not from his wounds, not from the fight. Someone had gotten to him, and they had left a message. Carved into Carter's chest, in jagged, bloody letters, were 3 words. "You were warned." Madeline staggered back. She barely heard Lisa speaking. She barely felt her own heartbeat. All she knew was one thing. They weren't just trying to silence Carter. They were sending her a message, and she understood it loud and clear. They were coming for her next. When Ethan stormed into the hospital, his rage was barely contained. He saw Carter's body. He saw the carved words, and something inside him snapped. "No more," he growled. "No more hiding. No more waiting." He turned to Madeline, his eyes blazing. "We end this. Tonight." Madeline nodded. "Then let's find Mercer." And just like that, they made a decision. They weren't running anymore. Ethan, Madeline, and Marcus tracked Mercer to his private estate, a heavily guarded mansion on the outskirts of town. They knew it was a trap. They went anyway. Dressed in black tactical gear, armed with every resource they had left, they approached the estate. The wind howled around them. Madeline gripped Ethan's hand. "Whatever happens," she whispered, "we do this together." Ethan nodded once, and then, with one final breath, they stepped into the lion's den. Inside the estate, Mercer was waiting for them, surrounded by armed guards, seated like a king on his throne. He smirked as they entered. "Well, well," he drawled. "I was wondering when you'd finally show up." Ethan raised his gun. "Where is Lena?" Mercer's smirk widened. "You think you're in control here, Walker?" He laughed. "You walked straight into my trap." The lights cut out. Gunfire erupted, and the war began. It was chaos. Bullets flew. Glass shattered. The world turned red. Marcus tackled a guard, disarming him. Ethan fired, taking down 2 men, before a bullet grazed his shoulder. Madeline ran through the halls, searching, praying. Then she heard it. A soft cry. She froze, then turned. A door stood ajar at the end of the hall. She ran toward it, kicked it open, and there, chained to a chair, was Lena. Madeline rushed to Lena's side, hands fumbling with the chains. "Madeline!" Lena's voice was weak. "Is it really you?" Tears burned Madeline's eyes. "We're getting you out of here." A gun cocked behind them. "You really shouldn't have come." Mercer's voice sneered. Madeline turned, her heart pounding. Mercer stood in the doorway, gun aimed directly at her head. But before he could fire, a single gunshot rang out. Mercer staggered back, eyes wide. Then he collapsed. Madeline gasped, turning. Ethan stood in the doorway, his gun smoking. His eyes met hers. "It's over." Lena was free. Mercer was dead. And Amara? Amara finally had her mother back. The nightmare was over. Ethan wrapped an arm around Madeline. "You did it," he whispered. Madeline exhaled, leaning into him. "No," she murmured. "We did." And as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, they walked away from the estate. Finally free, the battle at Mercer's estate was over. But the storm hadn't passed. It was only the beginning of the fallout. Lena sat wrapped in a blanket, in the back of an ambulance, her hands trembling as she sipped a cup of tea. Her eyes, hollow and distant, stared at nothing. Ethan stood beside her, his own wounds ignored, watching as Madeline checked Amara for injuries. The little girl clung to her mother, afraid to let go. For the first time in 7 years, she was back in Lena's arms. But was Lena ready to hold on? Even as Amara curled into her, whispering, "Mommy, I missed you." Lena didn't respond, didn't speak, didn't cry. It was like she was somewhere else, trapped in the prison of her own memories. Madeline noticed immediately. She sat beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Lena," she said softly. No response. Ethan stepped forward, his voice cautious. "Lena, Mercer is dead. You're safe now." Still nothing. Just the quiet hum of the ambulance, the distant chatter of officers, and the weight of everything that had been lost. Amara's tiny hand tugged on Lena's sleeve. "Mommy?" And finally Lena blinked. A single tear slid down her cheek. Then, in a voice so broken it barely existed, she whispered, "I don't know how to be her mother anymore." 2 days passed. Ethan and Madeline brought Lena and Amara back to their home. For the first time in years, mother and daughter had a safe place to rest. But it wasn't easy. Lena barely spoke. She flinched at loud noises. She never went near windows. At night, Madeline heard her screams. The memories of 7 years in captivity wouldn't disappear overnight. Amara tried everything, drawing pictures, telling stories, hugging her tightly. But every time she whispered, "Mommy, I love you," Lena only stared at her hands, as if she didn't know what to do with them. And it broke Madeline's heart. She had fought so hard to bring them together. But what if Lena was too broken to be whole again? While Lena struggled to reclaim her life, the world outside moved fast. Ethan was pulled into a legal war. Mercer was dead, but his empire was still alive, and the people who served him wanted payback. They challenged everything: Lena's past, her trauma, her right to keep Amara. They painted her as an unstable woman, an unfit mother, and they had the money to make it stick. One lawyer even said, "Perhaps it's in the child's best interest to remain with Officer Walker and his wife." Madeline nearly punched him. But deep down, she feared something terrible. What if Lena agreed? Late one night, Madeline found Lena in the backyard, sitting alone in the dark. She was holding a picture of herself and Amara, taken before she disappeared. Madeline approached slowly. "Lena, You should be inside. Lena didn't look up. I don't deserve to be her mother. Madeline stilled. That's not true. Lena let out a broken laugh. Isn't it? I let them take me. I let her grow up alone. And now, she looks at me like I'm supposed to be someone I don't remember how to be. Madeline crouched beside her. She doesn't need you to be perfect, Lena. She just needs you to try. Lena's fingers curled into fists. And what if I fail? Madeline's voice softened. You won't. Lena finally looked at her. And for the first time, Madeline saw something in her, besides fear. Hope. A flicker. Small. Fragile. But real. The next morning, Lena walked into court, shoulders squared. She wasn't the same woman who had shaken in silence days ago. She was ready to fight. The trial was brutal. Mercer's former allies dragged her past into the light, twisting it. They tried to prove she was a danger, a woman who had lost too much to be stable. But then, Lena did something that silenced the entire courtroom. She stood and spoke for herself. I survived, she said, her voice steady. For 7 years I survived. Not for me. For my daughter. I never stopped thinking about her. Never stopped praying that one day I'd hold her again. And now that I do, I will never let her go. Then, she looked at the judge. All I ask is a chance. Let me be her mother again. The courtroom fell silent. And then, after what felt like eternity, the judge made his ruling. Full custody granted to Lena Harrison. Tears streamed down her face. Amara ran into her arms, and for the first time, Lena held her without hesitation. Madeline smiled, eyes brimming with emotion. They had won. A month later, Madeline and Ethan stood on Lena's porch, watching as Amara played in the yard. Lena looked different now, stronger, whole. I don't know how to thank you, Lena whispered. Madeline smiled. You don't have to. Ethan folded his arms. You're part of our family, Lena. That won't change. Lena's eyes softened. I won't forget what you did for us. Amara ran up, grinning. Mommy, can Madeline and Ethan stay for dinner? Lena laughed, and for the first time, it wasn't filled with pain. Madeline met Ethan's gaze, and she knew. This wasn't just a rescue story. It was the start of something beautiful. 5 years later, Madeline, Ethan, Lena, and Amara sat in a sunny backyard, watching kids chase each other with water balloons. Amara, now a bright and happy 12-year-old, was helping Madeline set the table. Lena was laughing, her hand resting on a small baby bump. Ethan kissed Madeline's temple. So, when are we telling them? Madeline smiled, placing a hand over her stomach. Dinner, she whispered, because soon their family was about to grow again. And as they all sat together sharing stories and laughter, Madeline realized something. This wasn't just Lena and Amara's story. It was theirs, a story about love, loss, and finding home. Even when you thought it was lost forever, the courtroom battle was over. Lena had won custody of Amara. But in the shadows, the fight was far from finished. Ethan knew that Mercer's empire had been dismantled, but not erased, and the people who had benefited from his corruption weren't just going to let it go. Which meant his family wasn't safe yet. It started small. A black car parked a little too long outside their house. A shadowy figure spotted near the community center, watching Amara from a distance. Then, one night, Madeline woke up to a strange sound, not from inside the house, but outside. She nudged Ethan awake. Do you hear that? He was instantly alert, reaching for his gun. Stay here. Madeline grabbed his arm. Ethan. But he was already moving, checking the front porch. At first there was nothing, just the quiet hum of the streetlights. Then, A package sat on the welcome mat, with no return address. Inside, a single photograph of Amara. From earlier that day, Ethan's blood ran cold. "This isn't over," Ethan said, gripping the photo. "Someone's still out there." Lena tensed, holding Amara closer. Madeline felt her stomach twist. "But Mercer is dead. His network is gone." Ethan shook his head. "Not all of them." He turned to Lena. "Did Mercer ever talk about his partners? Anyone who might still be pulling strings?" Lena hesitated, her hands trembling slightly. "There was someone," she admitted. Ethan leaned in. "Who?" She swallowed hard. "A man named Graham Fletcher." The name meant nothing to Madeline, but Ethan's jaw tightened. Madeline noticed immediately. "You know him." Ethan exhaled slowly. "Yeah, I know him." Lena frowned. "Who is he?" Ethan's voice darkened. "A politician. A businessman. A man with a lot of money and very little conscience." Lena's face went pale. "He used to come by Mercer's estate. He was interested in Mercer's operations, but Mercer never let him get too involved." Ethan gritted his teeth. "If Fletcher is still around, then he's tying up loose ends." And now, that loose end was Amara. Ethan didn't wait. Within 24 hours, he had moved Lena and Amara to a safe house on the edge of town. It wasn't much, just a small cabin in the woods, rented under a false name. But it was secure. No internet, no phones, no way to track them. Lena sat in the kitchen, staring at the empty cup in her hands. Amara played quietly nearby, drawing pictures. Madeline sat beside Lena, voice gentle. "Are you okay?" Lena laughed bitterly. "I haven't been okay in years." Madeline reached for her hand. "You're safe now." Lena hesitated, then whispered words that sent chills down Madeline's spine. "You don't understand. If Fletcher is involved, we'll never be safe." While Lena and Amara stayed hidden, Ethan went on the offensive. He dug into Fletcher's financials, his business connections, his dirty secrets. And then he found it. A warehouse on the outskirts of town, owned by a shell company, with recent transactions linked to Fletcher. It was his first real lead, and Ethan wasn't going to wait for backup. Ethan pulled up outside the warehouse, his gun at the ready. The place was dark, abandoned. At least that's how it looked. But Ethan wasn't fooled. He moved slowly, scanning every shadow. And then, a voice. "You shouldn't have come here, Officer Walker." Ethan turned instantly, gun raised. A man stepped from the shadows. Graham Fletcher. And he was smiling. "I was wondering when you'd find me," Fletcher said. Ethan didn't lower his gun. "Stay where you are." Fletcher chuckled. "You and I both know you won't shoot me?" "Not yet, anyway." Ethan's grip tightened. "You sent men after Amara." Fletcher tilted his head. "Did I?" Ethan's finger twitched on the trigger. Fletcher sighed. "You're making a mistake, Walker." Ethan's voice was ice cold. "Number you did." And then, everything exploded into motion. Men emerged from the shadows, guns drawn. Ethan dove behind cover, firing back. Bullets shattered crates, sparks flew. But Ethan was outnumbered. He had to get out. He raced toward the exit, dodging gunfire. A bullet grazed his arm, but he didn't stop. He burst through the door, jumped into his car, and sped away. Behind him, Fletcher watched, calm and composed, a satisfied smirk on his lips. "This is just the beginning," he murmured. Ethan arrived at dawn, his shirt stained with blood. Madeline rushed to him. "Ethan!" "I'm fine," he said quickly. "But we have a problem." Lena's heart pounded. "What kind of problem?" Ethan locked eyes with her. "Fletcher knows where you are." Silence filled the room. Then, Madeline's voice, steady and fierce. "What do we do?" Ethan took a breath, and then, with absolute certainty, he said, "We end this." The air inside the safe house was thick with tension. Lena sat at the edge of the worn-out couch, her hands clenched into fists. Madeline paced by the window, stealing anxious glances at the tree line beyond. Ethan, still in his blood-stained shirt, stood at the table, spreading out a detailed map of Oak Ridge. His jaw was tight, his eyes dark with determination. "Fletcher knows we're here," he said grimly. "That means we don't have much time." Lena swallowed hard. "What do we do?" Ethan exhaled. "We take the fight to him." Madeline's head snapped toward him. "Ethan!" He raised a hand before she could protest. "I know it's dangerous, but if we don't act now, he'll keep coming. He won't stop until he gets what he wants." Lena's voice was barely a whisper. "Which is Amara?" The room fell silent. Amara, sitting quietly in the corner with a stuffed bear clutched to her chest, lifted her big brown eyes toward them. "I don't want to hide anymore," she said softly. Lena's heart shattered. She rushed to her daughter, pulling her into a tight embrace. "Baby, you don't have to worry about anything. I'll protect you." Ethan's gaze hardened. "No," he said. "We all will." Ethan pulled a chair close and motioned for them to gather. "We need a strategy," he said. "We can't just sit here and wait for Fletcher's men to come knocking." Madeline crossed her arms. "You have something in mind?" Ethan nodded. "Fletcher's operation isn't just about Mercer's old network. He's been using his position to cover something bigger." Lena looked up. "What do you mean?" Ethan tapped the map. "I checked the financial records. He's not just running an underground network. He's laundering money for powerful people. That's why he's so desperate to silence you." Madeline's breath caught. "If that's true, then—" Ethan cut her off. "We need proof. Evidence that links him to these deals. Something that would force law enforcement to take him down for good." Lena hesitated. Then slowly, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small black USB drive. "What's that?" Madeline asked. Lena took a shaky breath. "Oh, I took this from Mercer's office the night I ran. I never knew what was on it. But I think it might be what you're looking for." Ethan's pulse kicked up. He grabbed his laptop, plugged in the drive, and began scrolling through the files. What he saw made his stomach drop. Names, dates, transactions worth millions, and Fletcher's name everywhere. "This is it," Ethan murmured. "This is what we need." Lena's face paled. "Then, we have to go public." Ethan shook his head. "Not yet. If we leak this, Fletcher will know. We need to bring it to someone who can act fast, someone we can trust." Madeline frowned. "Who?" Ethan met her gaze. "I have one last card to play." Ethan made the call at dawn. "Detective Carter," he said when the line picked up. A deep sigh came from the other end. "Walker," the voice replied. "I was wondering when I'd hear from you." Detective James Carter was an old friend, one of the few people Ethan still trusted in law enforcement. "I need your help," Ethan said. Carter's tone darkened. "Fletcher?" Ethan nodded. "We have the proof, but we don't have time. He's coming for Lena and Amara." Carter was silent for a long moment. Then, "Where do you need me?" That evening, they set the plan in motion. Lena and Amara would remain hidden at the safe house, under police protection. Meanwhile, Ethan and Carter would lure Fletcher into the open. The plan was dangerous, but it was the only way. The meeting place? An abandoned steel mill on the edge of town. Carter arranged for backup, but Ethan knew. If this went wrong, there was no second chance. Ethan arrived first. The steel mill was silent, save for the rustling of the wind. Then, a car approached. Headlights cut through the dark. Fletcher stepped out, flanked by two armed men. He smirked. "Well, well, Officer Walker, you've been busy." Ethan's grip on his gun tightened. Fletcher took a slow step forward. "Where's the girl?" Ethan's voice was ice cold. "You'll never touch her." Fletcher chuckled. "Brave words, Walker. But we both know how this ends." A signal from Fletcher. His men raised their guns. Ethan didn't hesitate. He ducked for cover just as the first shot rang out. Bullets ripped through the air. Carter and his backup stormed in, returning fire. Chaos erupted. Ethan moved fast, weaving between rusted beams, taking down one of Fletcher's men. Then, a gun pressed against his temple. Fletcher, smiling. "Did you really think you'd win, Walker?" he whispered. Ethan gritted his teeth. Then, a gunshot. Fletcher staggered backward, blood blossoming across his chest. Ethan turned. Madeline stood there, gun shaking in her hands. Her eyes blazed with fury. "Stay away from my family," she hissed. Fletcher collapsed. It was over. The arrests came swiftly. With the evidence from the USB drive, Fletcher's entire network crumbled. High-profile names were exposed. Justice was served. Lena and Amara were finally safe. And for the first time in years, they could breathe again. As Ethan and Madeline sat on their porch, watching Amara play, Madeline rested her head on Ethan's shoulder. "It's over," she whispered. Ethan smiled softly. "No," he murmured. It's just the beginning." The morning light filtered softly through the curtains, casting a warm glow over the living room. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the Walker household was quiet. No more fear. No more running. Madeline sat on the couch, a steaming mug of coffee in her hands, staring out the window. Outside, Amara was playing in the yard, her laughter ringing through the crisp autumn air. Lena was beside her, watching her daughter with an expression of pure relief. "She looks happy," Lena murmured. Madeline nodded. "She is, and she's safe now." Lena turned, meeting Madeline's gaze. "Thanks to you and Ethan." Madeline reached out and squeezed her hand. "We did what anyone would do." Lena gave a soft, disbelieving laugh. "No, you didn't. You risked everything. And you saved my little girl." Madeline smiled, but before she could reply, the front door opened. Ethan walked in, looking tired but satisfied. He had just returned from the station, where he and Carter had spent the night wrapping up the case. "It's done," he announced. "Fletcher is facing multiple federal charges. His entire operation is gone." Lena exhaled sharply, like she had been holding her breath for years. "So, it's really over," she whispered. Ethan nodded. "Yeah, it's over." Lena closed her eyes, letting the weight of the last 7 years finally lift from her shoulders. Then, Amara ran inside, her cheeks flushed from the cold, her eyes shining. "Mommy," she called, flinging herself into Lena's arms. Lena held her close, pressing a kiss to the top of her daughter's head. Ethan and Madeline exchanged a glance, their hearts swelling at the sight. But even as relief washed over them, they knew the journey wasn't over yet. The next few weeks were a transition period for everyone. Lena and Amara stayed at the Walkers' home while arrangements were made for them to move into a safe, permanent place. Madeline took Amara to the community center, enrolling her in school and helping her adjust to a normal routine. Ethan worked with Detective Carter, following up on the corruption that had been uncovered. But the hardest adjustment was emotional. For Lena, after years of fear, learning to trust the world again was difficult. For Amara, recovering from the trauma of being hunted wasn't something that would happen overnight. And for Madeline and Ethan, stepping out of survival mode and into a future without danger felt strange. One evening after Amara had gone to bed, Lena sat at the kitchen table, stirring her tea absently. "Do you think I'll ever feel normal again?" she asked softly. Madeline sat down across from her. "I think normal looks different for everyone," she said. "But I do think you'll feel safe again. And I think, one day, this will all feel like a bad dream." Lena smiled weakly, but uncertainty lingered in her eyes. Ethan walked in, hearing the last part of the conversation. He placed a file on the table in front of Lena. She hesitated. "What's this?" Ethan gave her a reassuring look. "The official documentation for your new identity and witness protection arrangements. The FBI is helping you relocate to a place where no one from your past can find you." Lena's hands trembled as she opened the file. A new name, a new address, a fresh start. Tears welled in her eyes. "You really did all of this for us?" she whispered. Ethan nodded. "You deserve to be free, Lena. Both of you do." She covered her mouth, overwhelmed with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," she choked out. Madeline squeezed her hand. "Just be happy, that's thanks enough." The day Lena and Amara left Oak Ridge was bittersweet. A black SUV pulled into the driveway, an FBI agent stepping out to help them with their bags. Amara stood beside Madeline, her little hands gripping the fabric of Madeline's coat. "I don't want to go," she whispered. Madeline crouched down, cupping Amara's face in her hands. "I know, sweetie," she said softly, "but this is a good thing. You and your mommy are going to have a brand new life, a safe life." Amara sniffled, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Will I see you again?" Madeline swallowed the lump in her throat. "Yes," she promised. "We'll always be here for you." Ethan stepped forward, resting a gentle hand on Amara's head. "You're one of the bravest kids I've ever met," he told her. "You're going to be okay, Amara. I know it." Amara gave a small nod and threw herself into Madeline's arms one last time. Then, Lena hugged both of them, her voice thick with emotion. "I'll never forget what you did for us," she whispered. "Never." Ethan and Madeline watched as Lena and Amara climbed into the SUV. As it drove away, disappearing down the road, Madeline felt a deep ache in her chest. But she also felt something else. Hope. Amara was safe. Lena was free. And their story wasn't over yet. A week passed. Madeline was back at work at the community center. But something was missing. The house felt quieter. The days felt emptier. One evening, as she and Ethan sat on the porch, watching the sunset, Madeline sighed. "I miss them," she admitted. Ethan took her hand. "Me too," he said. "But we did the right thing." Madeline nodded. But there was something else weighing on her. After a long pause, she whispered, "Ethan, I think I'm ready." He turned to her, brow furrowed. "Ready for what?" She looked up at him, her eyes shining. "To start a family of our own." Ethan's breath caught. For a long moment, he just stared at her. Then, a slow, incredibly joyful smile spread across his face. "Yeah?" he asked softly. Madeline nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. Ethan pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. They had faced danger. They had fought for justice. And now, they were ready for their next chapter. A new beginning. A new future. Together. The morning sun bathed Oak Ridge in a golden glow as Madeline Walker stepped out onto the porch, cradling a steaming cup of coffee in her hands. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves, blending with the distant aroma of fresh pastries from the neighborhood bakery. It was a peaceful morning, the kind of peace she and Ethan had fought so hard to create. She glanced toward the yard, where laughter rang out. A little girl, 4 years old, with Ethan's dark brown hair and Madeline's green eyes, was running barefoot through the grass, her giggles echoing. "Lily, slow down, honey," Madeline called, amused. "Can't catch me, Daddy." Lily squealed as Ethan chased her, pretending to stumble over invisible obstacles. Madeline's heart swelled at the sight. This was their life now. Safe, happy, full of love. But just as she was about to take a sip of coffee, the sound of an approaching car caught her attention. Her heart skipped a beat, because she knew exactly who it was. The black SUV pulled into the driveway, just as it had 5 years ago, when Lena and Amara had left Oak Ridge to start their new life. Madeline hurried down the steps as the doors opened, and then she saw her. Amara. She had grown. No longer the frightened, silent little girl Madeline had once met, but a confident young teenager, now 12 years old, with a radiant smile and eyes full of life. Lena stepped out after her, looking just as happy. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, Amara ran forward. "Madeline!" she cried. Madeline caught her in a tight embrace, laughing through the tears that filled her eyes. "You're so big," she whispered, "and so beautiful." Amara grinned. "You're still short," Madeline gasped, mock offended, then ruffled the girl's curly hair. "Oh, you've gotten sassy, huh?" Ethan approached, his own smile broad. "Amara!" "Ethan!" Amara beamed and threw her arms around him, squeezing tightly. Lena watched, emotion shining in her eyes. "I told you we'd see each other again," Madeline said, turning to Lena. Lena nodded, smiling through tears. "And this time it's not goodbye." Inside, the house was filled with chatter and laughter. Madeline set out homemade cookies and lemonade, and the warmth of old friendships filled the air. Amara sat next to Lily, her honorary little sister, who was absolutely fascinated by her. "You're so cool," Lily whispered. "I want to be just like you when I grow up." Amara chuckled. "Trust me, kiddo, you do not want to be me." Madeline and Lena exchanged a glance. They both knew Amara had been through so much, but despite her hardships, she had blossomed into a strong, resilient young girl. "So," Ethan leaned forward, "tell us everything. How's life?" Lena smiled. "We're good. Actually, we're really good." She hesitated, then reached into her purse, pulling out a business card and sliding it across the table to Madeline. Madeline read it. "Lena Harrison, social worker." Her eyes widened. "Lena, you—" "I got my degree," Lena said, her voice full of quiet pride. "I work at a nonprofit now, helping at-risk kids and domestic abuse survivors." Madeline felt a lump form in her throat. "Lena, that's amazing." Lena gave a small, tearful laugh. "I never thought I'd be here. But because of you and Ethan, I got a second chance." Ethan nodded approvingly. "You did that for yourself, Lena. We just helped open the door." Lena glanced at her daughter. "And Amara. She's doing incredible. Straight A's, soccer star. She's got big dreams." Madeline turned to Amara. "What do you want to do when you grow up?" Amara grinned. "I want to be a detective, like Ethan." Ethan's eyebrows shot up. "No kidding?" She nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "I want to help people the way you helped me." As the evening stretched on, the house was filled with love, stories, and shared memories. At one point, Madeline and Amara sat together on the back porch, looking up at the stars. "I used to think heroes were like the ones in comic books," Amara said softly. Madeline glanced at her. "And now?" Amara smiled. "Now, I know that heroes look like regular people, like you and Ethan." Madeline's heart clenched. "Oh, sweetheart. I wouldn't be here without you," Amara whispered. "And I don't mean alive. I mean, I wouldn't be the person I am. You didn't just save me. You showed me what love is." Tears burned Madeline's eyes. She pulled Amara into a hug. "You're going to do great things, Amara. I know it." Amara leaned into her, smiling softly. As the night grew late, Lena and Amara prepared to leave. But this time, it wasn't a goodbye. It was a see you later. Before getting into the car, Amara turned back to Ethan. "I still want to be a detective," she said. "Think you could teach me?" Ethan chuckled, crossing his arms. "You serious?" Amara nodded. "All right," Ethan said. "We'll start with the basics next time you visit." Amara beamed. With one last hug, they climbed into the SUV. Madeline and Ethan watched as they drove away. And this time, there was no sadness, only peace and hope. The Oak Ridge Community Center had a brand new wing. A plaque stood at the entrance, the Amara Foundation, dedicated to children who need a safe place to land. Madeline stood next to Lena, both of them fighting back tears as they watched children run inside, excited for the new programs and resources now available. Ethan walked up, slipping an arm around his wife. "You did it," he said softly. Madeline turned to him. "We did." Lena smiled, not knowing how far they had come. And as Amara ran past them, laughing with her new friends, it was clear. Their story wasn't just one of survival. It was one of hope, resilience, and a love that never wavered. And that was a legacy worth leaving behind. Amara's journey wasn't just about survival. It was about hope, resilience, and the power of human kindness. It took one person, one moment of compassion, to change her life forever. But now, let's turn the question to you. What would you have done if you were in Madeline and Ethan's shoes? Would you have followed your instincts? Would you have risked everything to help a little girl with no name? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. And if this story moved you, if it made you think, feel, or even shed a tear, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because stories like this, they remind us that even in the darkest moments, there's always light. And trust me, you won't want to miss the next one. See you soon. Love.